Welcome to Our Change Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter. Tonight we're working by request. We're going to be unpacking the Cecil Hotel, its history, all of the deaths, the hauntings, you name it. We're going to be looking into this. Now, this episode was requested by a friend of mine, Dina Gore. And Dina and I met on this Dark Art Society website on Facebook, a Facebook group, where the Dark Art Society is an artist group that does dark, macabre, and interesting artworks. And she is an absolutely amazing artist. Her work is incredible. She works very colorful. And she does a lot of pop cultural references in her paintings, so things from TV, movies, video games. And she has originals for sale. She has prints. She does mixed media work. She's just an absolutely incredible artist. So my recommendation is go to her website, thegoredgoods.net. Take a look at what she has to offer. She and I were talking about, cryptids, which is my favorite subject. And she started talking to me about, what about these hotels? Like the Winchester House, which is not a hotel, but, fascinating places. And one of the ones that she mentioned was the Cecil Hotel. And I've been wanting to look into that anyway at some point because of the hauntings. I'm into ghosts and cryptids as well. But she was really fascinated with the Cecil Hotel as well. And her recommendation, I'm doing this episode now. So this episode is dedicated to Dina and her suggestion. And I really appreciate her having that conversation with me so I can get this started. Now, before I get too far along, I want to talk about a disclaimer here. So this episode contains discussion of real-world violence, suicide, mental illness, and death. And these topics are presented for informational and investigative purposes only, and viewer discretion is advised, especially for anyone who may be sensitive to these subjects. So if this topic or these topics makes you unsettled, then I suggest you stop now and go listen to one of my other ones about cryptids. I think that would be a much better one. The other thing I'll say is that if you or someone you know is struggling or experiencing thoughts of self-harm, there is a crisis hotline in the United States. It's a suicide and crisis hotline. You simply dial or text 988 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and someone will help you out. I am not sure what sort of resources you have available to you outside of the United States, but hopefully your country does have one. And I've even heard that some people have tried contacting the suicide and prevention hotline in the United States from outside of the United States, and were also able to get help. I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm saying try to look for local, and if you can't find it, then please reach out anywhere you can for that support. All right, so let's get into the history of the Cecil. So the Cecil Hotel was built in 1924 in downtown Los Angeles, and it was built in a Beaux Arts or Art Deco style, which was very popular during the 1920s. And it's beautiful inside. It's a gorgeous hotel. And it was built for travelers, for business travelers, and for tourists. And during the Roaring 20s, people had copious amounts of money for the most part and were able to go enjoy themselves. But within 5 years of that hotel being built, the Great Depression happened. And this happened 1929 is when it started. The market crashed. People were destitute. And there was also at that same time a dust bowl, or basically this great drought in the states that produced most of the farm, the produce. There was a huge drought which caused widespread famine and poverty. So there were many people out of work. There were many people that were suffering. And so this place just basically fell into, not ruin, because it was still continuously being used, but it wasn't used to the same standard as it should have been, what it was meant to be, which was this opulent place to go visit. The area around the hotel over the decline from, I think it was 1929 to 36, was the Great Depression era. And over that time period, they just fell into sort of a massive amount of people living as a homeless situation around the Cecil Hotel. And so the area in Los Angeles around the Cecil became known as Skid Row. So there was lots of homelessness. There was lots of people that were sick. Now, when they would come upon some money, what they would do is they would rent rooms for the night or a couple of nights at the Cecil. And so there was people that were sick. There were people that were mentally unwell, and they were residing in these spaces. The Cecil was also used for clandestine visits of, lovers. And so they would rent the room for an hour or two and then be on their way. So there was just loads of transition from its grandeur to sort of a less than savory place to go visit. During that time period, almost immediately, I would say 3 years after the construction and the opening of the Cecil Hotel, the very first suicide takes place within the building. So January 22nd, 1927, a man by the name of Percy Cook, who was 57 years old, shot himself in the head. And he did so, he said in his suicide note, that he was estranged from his wife and his family, and he saw it as unreconcilable, so he just, decided to end his life, which is unfortunate. The one that was most widespread was the one that people talked about in the 1930s, and I think this is also due to sort of that the Great Depression time frame where people were actually jumping from buildings at the Empire State Building and things like that. So there was a lot of suicides, and they started becoming more noticed. They were more talked about, I would say. And so in November 19th of 1931, W.K. Norton, who was 46, died of possible suicide. Now, what he was doing apparently was swallowing these poison capsules, and perhaps he didn't know that they were poison. He checked into the hotel under an alias, James Willis, from Chicago. But there was no suicide note, so it was as if he maybe didn't know that those pills that he was taking were poisonous. In September of 1932, Benjamin Dodich, who was 25, died from a gunshot wound to the head, which was deemed suicide, but there was no note. And sometimes when there's no note, like typically people who are deciding to leave this life, they leave a note for friends and family to let them know why they did what they did. And in this instance, there was no note. And so it could be possible that someone either coerced him to do it or did that to him and then made it look like a suicide. July 26, 1934, Sergeant Lewis Borden, who was 53, left multiple notes talking about his declining health and decided to end his life by slitting his own throat with a straight razor. In 1937, March of 1937, Grace Magro, 25, fell from the building and was entangled in the electrical wires above the street. So she fell from the building, hit the electrical wires, and got tangled up in there. They were able to pull her from those wires and take her to the hospital. The hospital that they took her to was Georgia Street Hospital, which has since been demolished. But she died later on at the hospital from her injuries. No note. So we don't know if she was pushed, if she accidentally fell, or decided to jump on her own. In January 9th of 1938, Roy Thompson, 35, jumped, and he was found on the neighboring building's skylight. Again, no note, and there's no idea if he was pushed, it was an accident, or it was intentional. In May of 1939, Edwin Neblett, who was 39 years old, died of a possible suicide. And again, this one was poison ingestion, and there was no note. January 10th through the 12th, 1940, Dorothy Seeger, who was 45, died of poison. She checked into the hotel under the alias Evelyn Brent, and a note was sent to her relatives. So apparently she was planning on taking her own life. But she died on January 12th, so she was found on January 10th, and she passed away at General Hospital on January 12th. In November of 1947, Robert Smith, who was 35, jumped from a 7th floor window. Again, no suicide note. October 22nd, 1954, Julia Frances Moore, 50, jumped from the 8th floor window and hit an interior light well. So there's like interior light spaces that are platforms, and she passed away there, and there was no note. So we don't know, again, if she actually jumped or was pushed or accidentally fell. On October 12, 1962, Pauline Otten, who was 27 years old, had an argument with her estranged husband and decided after he left to jump from the window. As a consequence of this, while she was falling, unfortunately, a man named George Giannini, who was 65, happened to be passing by beneath her, and when she hit him, they both died instantaneously. Now, at first they thought this was a double suicide, but then they later realized that Giannini had his hands in his pockets and his shoes were still on his feet. Like typically when there's a jump from a great height, you will lose your shoes either in the falling process or on the impact. And they figured out that he was actually just walking underneath her and unfortunately was in the wrong place at the wrong time. December 20th, 1975, an unidentified woman around 20 to 30 years old was found on the 2nd floor roof. So there was not a determination whether she had jumped. I'm assuming not. Her alias was Allison Lowell, and her room was 327, and the death was undetermined, and that's the reason why I say I don't think she jumped. It would be pretty obvious if she had. So they don't know what the cause of death was. June 12th of 2015, Jason Lazar, 28, was found outside, and they believe that it was suicide by defenestration, which basically means throwing yourself off of a building. Again, no suicide note. So, in total, there's 16 deaths attributed to that hotel. I want to say that there's most likely far more than what they're saying. And the reason why I say that is like you have people who are homeless, aged, infirm, and they're staying at this hotel. They don't talk about dying of natural causes. They don't talk about drug overdoses. They don't talk about other suspicious conditions or being beaten up or something like that. So there could be loads of things that happen in that hotel that they have not discussed. As far as murders are concerned, so this first one really is upsetting, and I'm going to caution you now. Talks about a newborn child. So in September of 1944, Dorothy Jean Purcell, who was 19 years old, was staying at the hotel with her boyfriend. The boyfriend was unaware that she was actually pregnant, according to them. Which I don't know how you would not know that your girlfriend is pregnant. Anyway, she went into labor, and instead of waking him up, she decided to go into the bathroom and deliver the baby. The infant was, she said, stillborn. So she said that it was a newborn death and didn't think it was alive, so therefore decided to just throw the baby out of the window. I don't know how anybody could think that logic the way that she did through. But she was arrested and then she was tried and found not guilty by reason of insanity. So perhaps there was some sort of psychotic break that took place as part of this pregnancy. I'm not going to justify what she did, and I don't understand it either, but it's just insane that would happen. And then June 4th of 1964, there was an older lady there who was named Goldie, but she had a nickname of Pigeon because she would go to the nearby park and feed the pigeons every day. So Goldie Pigeon Osgood was 65. She was raped, stabbed, beaten. The room was ransacked, and they caught a suspect named Jacques B. Ehlinger, who was 29, and they found him going through the same park that Goldie visited often, and he had blood on his clothes, and so he was arrested, and then he was cleared. So they said he wasn't involved whatsoever. And so the case is currently still unsolved. Now you have the information about the deaths and suicides that they talk about. What's interesting is that this place also had 2 serial killers living as residents in this location. So the first was Richard Ramirez, who stayed there from 1984 to 1985 as part of his murder spree in Los Angeles. So he would walk into people's homes. He would either rape or murder or attempt to murder. He would carry out burglaries. He would use a wide range of weapons, from guns and knives and blunt objects to any tools or improvised things that he could find to torture and humiliate his victims. You may know him as the Night Stalker or the Valley Intruder. So apparently Ramirez had an extremely severe childhood, was abused severely. He had neurological damage as part of that abuse, and he started using drugs heavily. And then as a teenager, he was influenced by his older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran with PTSD and schizophrenia, who exposed him to graphic stories of violence, and he murdered his wife in front of Ramirez when he was 15. So Ramirez got into Satanism and occult worship, and he also supported a cocaine addiction through burglary, which escalated into these violent crimes. Now, the other serial killer that was there was Jack Unterweger, who was an Austrian, and he committed at least 12 murders in Austria, West Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the United States. And initially he was convicted of a single murder in 1976, and then he began to write extensively while he was in prison, and his work gained attention of Austrian intellectuals who interpreted it as evidence of his supposed rehabilitation. So after significant lobbying, Unterweger was released on parole in 1990. But upon his release, he became a minor celebrity and worked as a playwright and a journalist. And then within months after his release, he resumed his killing spree. So Unterweger hung himself in prison after being convicted of 9 more murders in July of 1994. So there you have a little bit of the sordid history of the hotel. Now, I left one case out, which is extremely important and probably the one with the most notoriety, and that is the Elisa Lam story. So Elisa Lam was a Canadian tourist who was visiting Los Angeles. Elisa was 21 years old. She stood at height of 5 foot 4 inches tall and weighed a whopping 115 pounds, so very small, slight woman. She had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So the timeline is that she checks in January 26th of 2013, and then she was supposed to return very shortly after this trip. January 31st of 2013, she's reported as missing. And on February 19th of 2013, her body is discovered in a rooftop water tank. Now, there is video footage of her in an elevator acting erratically. She's pushing buttons, she's stepping in and out, she's gesturing to people. Many people think that she was either being pursued by someone or she was speaking to a spirit or an entity. So there is video that you can find of Elisa Lam in the elevator at the Cecil. Where her body was found, this water tank, it's up on the roof of the Cecil. It's one of the water tanks that provides drinking water, the potable water. This tank is a huge tank. It's, I don't know, I had a 600-gallon tank, which was, almost as tall as me, 6 foot tall. This thing provides water for the entire hotel, so it's very large. It has a lid on top, which is a square, and it's flat, and it weighs roughly 20 to 30 pounds. So this 115-pound woman would have to get onto the roof, and the door to the roof was locked. Now, she could have climbed out of a window and went up the fire escape and then climbed a ladder to get onto the roof if she wanted to. It's not impossible to get up there. But the doorway and the stairwell leading up to the roof was locked. There's no way that she could have gotten through in that way. The second thing that's weird, imagine climbing a metal ladder, right? It's, really thin handles, and it would hurt your feet if she's barefoot or even with thin shoes. So she's climbing up this ladder up to the top of the tank, which is about 15 feet tall, maybe a little bit more, I'm not sure. But it's a really large tank, 10 feet tall maybe. The lid of this tank weighs about 20 to 30 pounds to ensure that the wind doesn't just blow it off. So she would have to have one hand clutching the ladder and using her other arm to push 30 pounds over to allow her entry into the tank. And then inside the tank, there's no internal ladder or platform. It's just smooth walls. And the water level wasn't all the way up to the top. It was maybe about 18 inches below the rim. And she was much shorter than the height of this tank. So in order for her to close this tank, she would have had to tread water while lifting a 30-pound lid and close it back up. So closing the lid from the inside while treading water would be difficult for a huge dude, and having some small woman doing this is it's mechanically impossible. And like I said, the roof access was restricted, but it is physically possible to get there if you want to. Now, the autopsy revealed that she died of drowning and there was no trauma and there was no assault. But her toxicology report came back that she had not been taking her bipolar medication. Now, I have a brother, he was schizophrenic and bipolar. So I believe that schizophrenic, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist, but in schizophrenic episodes, you will talk to people that aren't there or see visions of things that aren't there. And the way that Elisa was acting on the elevator made me think that she was having a schizophrenic episode. Bipolar, typically, you're either manic or you're in depressive states, and you will either be withdrawn or you will be excited and happy and engaged and stuff like that, which is not the same as a schizophrenic episode. So even though she has this bipolar medication absence in her system, it doesn't account for the way that she was acting inside the elevator. So I want to move away from all of these reports and go into sort of what hauntings are associated with the Cecil. So apparently there's child apparitions that are being seen on the upper floors, which is a brief, non-interactive appearance, which makes me think that this is a residual haunting, which means that it's kind of like the playing back of a tape over and over again. It's not interactive whatsoever. You could talk to a residual haunting and it won't even acknowledge you. It's not intelligent. It's just a playback. There's a female apparition called the Woman in White, and she's seen near windows and mirrors around the building. And apparently there's also shadow figures that are being seen in hallways and in peripheral sighting. So like at the corner of your eye, you may see some dark figure down the hallway that then moves out of your vision as you turn to look towards it. And there's also heard footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing, and knocking at doors, the feeling of being watched, sudden episodes of fear, and many people are talking about chest pressure while sleeping, which sounds to me very similar to night terrors. But they're not seeing the little, like typically there's this night terror demon that people see, or an old hag. That's not being reported. They're just feeling the pressure of something sitting or pushing down on their chest. Typically when there are hauntings, you can look to the environment for sort of some possible explanations for that. It could be Indian burial grounds, or ley lines, or cemeteries, like places where people would have been buried, or ancient burial sites, just anything. And when I looked into this, I found nothing that was associated with the Cecil in that respect. There's no Indian burial grounds. It's just not there. It could be maybe a place where people died prior to, like maybe in the Stone Age. I don't know. But there's no visible Indian burial ground, or like any sort of records of that being found while they were building. That being said, there could have been suppression of that information while they were building. They could have found something and just to suppress that. I don't doubt that whatsoever, but there's no records of anything being found there. Ley lines are these theoretical lines of energy that make up the Earth's electromagnetic field. And at certain intersection points, they call them energy vortices, which could amplify spiritual or paranormal activity. And that's just not happening there. There's no ley lines associated with this. There's also this concept of the 37th parallel. So basically there's this idea that there is a band of high strangeness at the 37th parallel around the world. And the Cecil Hotel is about 250 miles away from the nearest edge of that band of high strangeness. So it's not even classically associated with those sorts of things. There's not really a body of water around, which is frequently associated with like hauntings. And there's no cemeteries or ancient burial sites. So the only thing I could find that sort of makes sense to me is sites of tragedy or trauma sometimes create more. And what I mean by that, so locations where intense emotional or traumatic events occurred, such as battlefields, old prisons, asylums, or sites of death, sometimes they're thought to retain emotional residue or psychic energy, leading to residual hauntings where past events play like a loop. And if you look at all of these deaths over the course of years, perhaps this site of tragedy or trauma is drawing in more trauma and tragedy. So I even looked at scientific explanations of things that attribute perceived hauntings to environmental factors. So like electromagnetic fields. Now, an old building with poor electrical equipment and old elevators does have really high EMF readings and could cause people to have sensations of being watched or feelings of anxiety. That's a possibility that's happening there. But that doesn't attribute all the deaths that have been there to that EMF spiking that takes place with older electrical equipment. There's also the possibility of infrasound. Now, infrasound is a low-frequency sound below human hearing, but it also can produce anxiety and the feeling of an unseen presence. What makes me think that it's possible is that the LA area is on a fault line, and fault lines rubbing together very far underground could produce this infrasound, this low rumbling sound that's not audible to the ear, but you can feel through your body. The other thing that could be happening is air quality inside the hotel itself. There was a report that was done. This newspaper went in, they took pictures to look at the Cecil Hotel, and they found that there was black mold all over. There was infestations of rats and cockroaches and poor communal facilities, that was very nasty. And this could provide some sort of like air toxin that could make people feel feelings of nauseousness or dizziness and things like that. There's also like really poor lighting inside this space. They have very narrow, compact, long hallways that has poor lighting, which could make people misinterpret what they're seeing in the distance, a person walking across the hallway. It could just be a shadow of a person walking across the highway instead of a shadow person. And the architecture of the building itself can make people think that it's eerie, specifically in these long liminal space hallways that are meant for passing through, not necessarily for lingering in. So if you're doing an investigation in these long hallways, it's going to feel odd because it's a place of transport, not of stationary engagement, right? So liminal spaces always feel weird because you're supposed to move through them, not stay in them. So, like I said, there's no verified sacred burial grounds, there's no ley lines, there's no unique geological or electromagnetic anomalies that make up the reason why this place is acting weird. So there's been multiple people too that have gone, like I know at least 3 times that the Ghost Adventures crew have actually gone to this hotel, and they've even brought a medium in. And of course, they're going to overly, dramatize anything that they find. But they really didn't find anything beyond just people's conversations about what they've seen and how it made them feel and stuff like that. So here's sort of where my mind goes. The Cecil Hotel has a really long documented history of tragedy. And I think tragedy can attract further tragedy. So as people in crisis tend to gravitate towards places with permissive anonymity, and there's already this established reputation of people taking their lives at this space. So maybe it draws people in who are wanting to do that as well. And I think that's the reason why places like the Cecil and other hotels that are haunted have this draw for people. Not necessarily people wanting to harm themselves, but people want to be sort of engaged in understanding human nature and spiritual elements. And they're drawn to places like this. And because there's already been tragedy there, maybe, like I said, like a magnet, it's just sort of pulling other tragic events to it. Okay, I don't have any insights or conclusions because I've not been there myself, and I would really like to go. I don't know if it's haunted. I would say that there's a high probability that it is, and it must be. If it is, it must be mostly residual hauntings, like a recorder playing back things. That's what I feel. If you've enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to share it with a friend, to rate and review. And I want to talk about, really quickly, I have a Patreon page. And not only do you get this podcast free of charge, which you get just about everywhere, but I have other things that I'm doing which I'm trying to monetize, and that would be case files, where I go into a great deal more detail than I do here in the podcast. I'm also writing a story, a book, and that book is about this young woman named named Midnight Hayes, and she is coming to America from Korea to find her father, and this takes place in the 80s. And along the way, she gets into these interesting paranormal events. That's all I'm going to say about it. But I am releasing 1 chapter or 2 chapters a month as I progress and move through writing. I have more chapters written than I've posted, so I'm going to continue to do that. And you get some other benefits as well. So take a look at my Patreon. It's Arcane Station Podcast. at Patreon, or go to my website, arcane-station.com, and you can reach me at mike@arcane-station.com if you want to be on the show, talk about your experiences, or just submit some ideas that you want to hear about. All right, that's it for tonight. Have a wonderful evening.